Okay, so just as a brief review of this unit in social epistemology overall, we started with discussing testimony. Testimony is a way that others can help our knowledge. Then we talked about echo chambers. Echo chambers are a way that others can hurt our knowledge. And then our final topic was evidentialism, both because I just think it's an interesting topic, but also because it highly involves and is challenged by these social considerations. So that's like a big picture overview of the three main topics from this unit. First, let's talk a little bit about testimony, just as a brief review. So the three views we talked about with testimony was testimony skepticism, and that is the view that we can never gain knowledge from testimony, or testimony is always guilty. Maybe you could increase your confidence from testimony, but you can't ever come to know something if all the evidence you have is just testimony. The problem is that there's a lot of things that we know just on the basis of testimony. So you couldn't know when or where you were born because you can't really go and verify that in any other way beyond just testimony. The second view we talked about is reductionism. That is the view that we can only gain knowledge from testimony if we have a good reason to think that the testifier is reliable. So this view, you could say it's the view that testimony is guilty until proven innocent. So, either if you have good reason to think all testimony is reliable, questionable whether there would be a good reason to trust all testimony no matter what, but also if you have a good reason to think one person's testimony in particular is reliable, then reductionism would say, in those cases, you could gain knowledge from testimony. And in this, on reductionism, you could know when you were born, assuming you had good reason to think that your parents' testimony was reliable. But the problem with this view is that it seems like children can know things from testimony. Their mom might say, we're going to the park later today. And then they could come to know, I'm going to the park later today. But the child isn't forming a belief, well, my mom is reliable, and since my mom is reliable, I can trust her testimony. She's just believing it. So this view, it seems hard to capture that children can know things from testimony. And it seems like even as adults, we often trust people, even though we don't have a good reason or an explicit belief that they're reliable. And it doesn't necessarily seem like this is always an irrational thing to do. The final view, and some of what we were just talking about might push people to this, is anti-reductionism. And that means that that's a view that we can gain knowledge from testimony, even if we don't have a good reason to think that the testifier is reliable. So testimony is innocent until proven guilty. We could have a defeater. A defeater gives us a good reason to think that someone's confused or lying, or just for whatever reason we shouldn't trust them. And then we shouldn't trust testimony. So anti-reductionists don't say we should always trust all testimony no matter what, and we can come to know things on testimony no matter what. That's not the view. It's just saying the default is in favor of trusting testimony is innocent until we have a defeater, until it's proven guilty. And the problem with this is you might just think, that's too trusting. This leads to gullibility. We need to question people more than what this view says. So those are sort of the three main views of testimony. The second big topic that we talked about is echo chambers. So we talked about the difference between echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. An epistemic bubble is a social network that excludes certain voices. So if you're in a social network and you're really just hearing voices that agree with you or agree with you on certain topics, that's an epistemic bubble. An echo chamber adds to that, so it's even stronger than that. It's a social network that doesn't just exclude certain voices, but it discredits certain voices. So it wouldn't just be all these people with the same political views as you, but they're also saying anyone who disagrees with us about politics is unreliable or bigoted, or you can't trust them. And so then even if you try to get out of that and be open-minded and see other views, if you trust these people in your social network, you're going to have a reason to discredit those outside voices. And one suggestion for how we might escape an echo chamber is by doing what's called a social epistemic reset. What this does is you suspend judgment on all of your beliefs, especially your beliefs about who to trust. And then you kind of start fresh. So you might remember in the meditations, Descartes said, how much can I doubt? What can I get rid of? He got rid of his everyday world beliefs about what he's perceiving. And then he said, well, can I doubt math and logic? Yes, I can, because what if an evil demon is deceiving me? And then he really got to this one fundamental piece of knowledge that he thought you couldn't doubt. I think, therefore I am. And the idea behind a social epistemic reset is that you kind of temporarily give up all your beliefs, give up your beliefs about who to trust, and then start fresh, build your foundation like Descartes did, and then sort of make new judgments about the things that you believe. The idea is that this is one way that you might escape an echo chamber. Okay, the third topic we talked about is evidentialism. Evidentialism is the view that what you should believe is determined only by your evidence. We also talked about 3 challenges to evidentialism. The first is epistemic partiality, which says that evidence isn't the only thing that determines what we should believe, but if someone is a close friend or family member, we could believe differently of them. We can apply a different standard of evidence to them. The second is moral encroachment. So moral encroachment says if you have a lot of evidence for something, but that belief is morally wrong or racist or sexist, then you shouldn't believe it. So not just evidence, but moral facts affect what you ought to believe. And then the final challenge to evidentialism is beneficial beliefs. So what if a belief would benefit us quite a bit? Remember the guy who was stuck in the middle of the wilderness, and he believed, if he believes he can make this jump and escape the wilderness, then that would make him more likely to make the jump. So that belief he can make the jump has benefits and few or no harms. If he believed he wouldn't make the jump, however, that would lead to a lot of harm. So it seems like it's way more beneficial for him to believe he could make the jump than to not, even though his chance of making the jump is like roughly 50-50. So all of these views challenge evidentialism and say, maybe evidence is part of the equation, but there's other things that besides evidence that affect what we should believe. Okay. So a lot of people in discussion posts and in reading responses wanted to kind of accept both views or accept multiple views at the same time. And they said, well, it just depends on the situation, whether you should be a testimony skeptic or a reductionist. I want to accept both, for example. So, can you have your cake and eat it too, is the question. So I basically just said that. Some people wanted to accept evidentialism or non-evidentialism, depending on the context or situation. So note that evidentialism and reductionism and testimony skepticism, they're claims about what is always the case. So an evidentialist would say, only evidence, that's always what determines rational belief. A reductionist would say, in all cases of knowing from testimony, you have to have good reason to think the testifier is reliable. And so because these are claims about what's always the case, if you think, well, sometimes you don't need to follow your evidence if there's moral stuff involved or if the belief is beneficial, but other times you should follow your evidence, then you're not an evidentialist, right? So an evidentialist would say, if there are any exceptions to this rule, then evidentialism is false, right? In the same way, if you think sometimes we can get testimonial knowledge without knowing the person is reliable, but sometimes we need to have the belief the person's reliable, then again, you're an anti-reductionist, because these views, evidentialism, reductionism, and testimony skepticism, again, they're claims about always, at all times, for all people. So if you want to say, I want to accept both views, you're probably actually, the non-evidentialist or the anti-reductionist. Okay, hopefully that clears that up for people. A couple people wondered, what is the point of Locke's formula? So Locke gives this formula where he gives, I think, 6 conditions for how we should weigh testimony. The number of witnesses, their integrity, their skill, the purpose they have in supplying their report, the internal consistency of what's conveyed and the circumstances of you're hearing it, and then whether there's contrary testimony. So those are that's Locke's formula, these 6 factors that we should weigh when considering testimony. But if Locke says we can never know from testimony anyway, what's the point of these 6 factors? Well, remember the three views of testimony are about whether we could gain knowledge from testimony. Locke still thinks that we could raise our confidence from testimony, even if we can't gain knowledge from testimony. So if someone tells you it's going to rain tomorrow, you could, instead of thinking there's a 50% chance of rain, raise your confidence a little bit and think there's a 60% chance of rain. But you couldn't come to know that it's going to rain tomorrow if all you have is testimony. So the point of Locke's formula and these 6 conditions tells us when we can raise our confidence and how much. But that's consistent with testimony never giving us knowledge. Okay, people were interested in whether most philosophers are evidentialists or not, which is actually a really interesting question. So I think I might have mentioned this before, but there's a survey that they've done, and it's called What Do Philosophers Believe? And they did it in 2013, and then they actually did another survey again last year. So they kind of updated the survey. So according to the one that was done last year, 35.7% of philosophers are internalists about justification, which is a view that's pretty similar to evidentialism. They didn't actually have a question directly about evidentialism, so this percentage might be slightly off. But yeah, it sounds like about 35% of philosophers are evidentialists. So, kind of an interesting statistic there. Okay. A little bit more on Rima Basu's view and how that interacts with evidentialism. So Basu definitely takes herself to be denying evidentialism and the view that we've talked about, moral encroachment, that directly challenges evidentialism. So Basu says, look, it's not like the facts are racist, but we live in this society that's structured by racism. And because of that, we can have strong misleading evidence to believe something that's racist. So this is a case where because believing something racist is immoral, we shouldn't follow our evidence. And that's why it denies evidentialism. So you might remember the John Hope Franklin case. If most of the people of color at a certain club are waitstaff, and you see a person of color, you might have good evidence they're waitstaff. But Rima says you shouldn't then believe they're waitstaff because that would wrong them. And in this, it's not just your evidence that determines what you should believe, but it's moral factors, whether a belief would wrong someone or be morally wrong. So if we have evidence for something that's sexist or racist, moral factors come into play. And this affects what we should believe. And so it's not just the evidence that determines what we should believe, but it's also these moral factors. So this is Basu's argument. Hopefully that kind of clears things up for people. Basu's view does deny evidentialism. Of course, you don't have to accept Basu's view, and you could try to come up with another explanation for these cases. But I just wanted to clear up the relationship between Rima's view and evidentialism. And evidence does matter too, right? So no one says evidence is totally irrelevant for what you should believe. All of these views thinks evidence is a factor in what you should believe, but the point is just that evidence isn't all that matters. That's what the people denying evidentialism say. And then the evidentialists say, no, evidence is all that matters. So this actually very cleanly goes into this next question that some people ask. What is evidence anyway? Like, how should we understand evidence? I think one good way to understand it is that it's an indicator of truth. So when you see Smith's fingerprints on the gun, they indicate that it is true that Smith committed the crime. So Smith's fingerprints on the gun are evidence that Smith committed the crime. If your weather app predicts a 90% chance of rain tomorrow, then this indicates that it will rain tomorrow. So evidence indicates that some statement is true. But here's why these other views we're talking about are challenges to evidentialism. So moral factors, whether a belief is morally wrong, whether someone is a close friend or family member, or whether a belief would benefit you, these don't indicate that the belief in question is true. That doesn't mean they're not important for other reasons, but they're not indicators of truth. And because of that, they're not evidence. And so if you think they affect what you should believe, then you're not an evidentialist. Okay, A couple people were interested in the cases of epistemic partiality. So these were the cases where Smith and your brother were both accused of the same crime. And one thing an evidentialist might say in response, and I think I talked about this briefly in the video, is that you just have different evidence. You have different evidence about your brother than about Smith. So in the example, the thought was in both cases, you have good but not perfect evidence that they did it. And we thought like, well, you can believe that Smith did it, but you shouldn't believe your brother did it until you have absolute proof, because he's your brother. You should apply a stricter standard of evidence. And then again, that raises the question, don't you have different evidence about your brother? I mean, you've grown up with him your whole life. You know about his character. You know all these facts about his childhood. And here, I think in response, we can kind of tweak the example. So suppose you are a Smith expert. You have detailed information about his life, diaries, home recordings, access to his social media, etc. So you know all these personal details about Smith in the same way you know all these personal details about your brother, but you have this personal relationship with your brother that you don't have with Smith. And then we can ask the same question, can you believe differently of your brother than of Smith, assuming you have tons of evidence about both of them? So I think the challenge could arise again if you think that what your personal relationship with someone should affect what you should believe. Okay, I think this is the final question. How does this unit relate to the previous units? Well, many of the questions we've been talking about in this unit are about knowledge. So in testimony case, we are talking about whether we could gain knowledge from testimony. And that relates to the previous units because we talked about what is knowledge, right? Justified, true, and get-eared belief, right? So that definitely relates to the previous units. But some of these questions are more about justification. So remember, justification is part of knowledge. It's when you have a good basis for a belief. And so kind of what we're asking in this unit is evidence what makes a belief justified or unjustified? Or do things besides evidence play a role in justification? It's also worth noting that a lot of people doing social epistemology generally tend to assume that at least widespread skepticism is false. Not everyone though. So Locke might be a kind of testimony skeptic. He thinks we can't have knowledge from testimony. But in general, a lot of people are sort of setting the skepticism question aside and kind of doing social epistemology, assuming that we do have some knowledge. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.